In order to keep our render times down, we need to understand how to optimize our render settings. So we're going to take a look at the real-time render settings and the heads-up display in KeyShot to figure out how we can do this. When I talk about the real-time render settings, I specifically am referring to the settings that we change over here in the project panel under the lighting tab. We call these the real-time render settings because they affect what we see here in the real-time view as we work. Additionally, I'm going to use something called the heads-up display, and I'll open that up by pressing H on my keyboard, and you see this gray box in the upper left-hand corner of the real-time view. That is the heads-up display. First of all, let's talk quickly about the heads-up display, and then we'll talk about our real-time render settings. This scene has stopped rendering after 5 minutes because of a setting I changed in the KeyShot preferences. We can see the time is frozen at 5 minutes within this heads-up display, and that's how I know. Now, in order to resume rendering the scene, I need to make a change to my real-time view, like perhaps my camera. So if I scroll my mouse out and then back in, we are back where we were, and you'll see that the time has started over again. It's at 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds. And the frames per second is going up at about 20 frames per second. Underneath, we have the samples count. Sampling is a process in which light is being cast into the scene from the camera, and it traces the path that the light takes throughout the scene. That way we are able to understand what color each pixel within our image should be. The more times we sample our scene, the more refined the image gets because it gets more and more accurate. And that's why we see when we start rendering a scene, lots of graininess because there's a lot of pixels that haven't been sampled yet. And over time, with more and more samples, we get more and more accurate, and a lot of that noise goes away and all those blanks get filled in with more accurate color information. So samples will increase forever as long as KeyShot is rendering. It's a progressive, real-time ray tracing render engine. So that's what that means. Progressive meaning the longer it sits, the longer it renders. Real time meaning we're seeing it render as we work. Ray tracing meaning it's tracing the light rays that are cast into the scene, and it's a render engine, so it's creating our images. So when we look at this heads-up display, it gives us information like how fast KeyShot is rendering. That's this 20 frames per second. And as we discussed probably a little bit before when I talked about CPU rendering and GPU rendering, we can increase our CPU usage, and by doing so, I will actually get a higher frame rate. And it's basically like the faster the GPU or the faster the CPU, the faster the frame rate, or the higher the frame rate. So the higher the frame rate, faster KeyShot's rendering. Time will always go up based on time. 1 minute and 1 second is 1 minute, 1 second. That is constant. And then samples will increase steadily as long as we are rendering. Now, how fast the samples go up depends on quite a few factors, such as how fast or how high our frame rate is, as well as the resolution of our image. So what I mean by that is if we look at resolution in this heads-up display, it says I'm at 1,464 pixels by 824. If I were to make this a lot smaller of a resolution, now it's at 940 by 529, my samples are increasing at a very fast rate, like 3 samples per second. That means my frames per second is also much, much faster. It's going up at almost 50 frames per second. So basically, we have the complexity of our scene, we have the real-time render settings, we have the resolution of the image, and we have the speed of our CPU or our GPU that all affect how quickly an image will be rendered. All those settings together determine what our frame rate is, our frames per second. And the higher the frames per second is, the faster the samples go up over time. So what we can do is by understanding the relationship between all these different settings, we can make some educated guesses to speed up our render time, or we can make our render settings a little more optimized so we can get faster render speeds. So with that, that's kind of the heads-up display, and that's how I suggest you use it. Bigger your real-time image is, like this. If I make this big, it slows things down. If I work with a smaller real-time resolution, it will render faster. Now, of course, when we render out our final frames for our animation, they're going to be at a higher resolution than this, or at least mine will be. I'm going to render out at 1920 by 1080p probably, which is high definition. But when I do that, it's a higher resolution here. So I can assume that it's going to take longer to render than this, or it will be slower. Now let's talk about these real-time render settings over here. In an attempt to simplify the real-time render settings, Luxeon has given us some lighting presets. We have, first of all, performance mode. I'm pretty sure you still cannot render in performance mode, but as long as I recall, performance mode has been something that you toggle on to make Keyshot really, really fast in the real-time view. You can see our frames per second is almost 200 at this point, and I'm only using half of my CPU cores. So that's very, very fast. This is to allow us to give us as little lag in the real-time view when setting up our scenes, especially moving lots of parts. Now, when we go into basic mode, this is the lowest render settings, I think, pretty much that we can render at least out of these presets. We can go and modify some of these numbers attached to this preset, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So here we're sitting in basic mode at 12, actually it's bouncing up to, I think, 20 frames per second, it looks like. When I go into product mode, it's going to, again, the visual change here is going to be noticeable, and it's going to change because when we go to product preset, we're changing all these settings down below here, our environment lighting settings, our general lighting, and our rendering technique. So watch for the real-time view, the change you see, as well as the frame rate or the frames per second that will change up here. So when I go to product mode, the visuals in the real-time view, they change slightly, not dramatically, but that's because we have a pretty simple lighting setup with just one physical light here. Unfortunately, we can see we have now dropped down to 13 frames per second instead of we were at 20 in basic mode. And that's because we have basically increased the complexity of the calculations that Keyshot is performing here. We have increased the shadow quality. We have added ground illumination. We have self shadows. We have 14 ray bounces. We have global illumination. So we have basically increased the complexity of the calculations that have to take place. And in theory, the real-time view, as well as the final renderings that we would produce here, should look a little bit more realistic than if we were in basic mode. So now I'm gonna go to interior mode, and let's see what happens here. So we were at 13 frames per second, and now we're bouncing back up over 22, which is pretty interesting. So why, when we went to interior mode, did the frames per second get higher? Well, that's because, again, we changed the settings in here. We have more ray bounces. We actually have more indirect or global illumination bounces. We have a lower shadow quality. Ground illumination's turned off. But most importantly, we're in interior mode rendering technique. So what's the big deal, and why do we have a product mode and an interior mode? And why is interior mode giving us faster results? Interior mode is a different lighting algorithm. These two render techniques here have different ways of calculating the lighting in the scene. Now, Luxeon tried to make them as similar as possible, meaning the results you get from product mode should look as good as the results you get from interior mode and vice versa. However, they're not going to match 100%, and that's because interior mode, as its name would imply, was written specifically to try to make it easier and faster to render interiors. What is unique about an interior? It's usually a room, kind of like inside of a box, where light can only make its way into that space from, say, an HDRI through a couple of windows. And because of that, it can take a lot longer for the light to find its way as it bounces throughout the scene through that window into the interior. And then you actually have to have more and more ray bounces in order to cast enough light to make the interior of the room look bright enough. That process can take a long time. So Luxeon created the interior mode, which is an optimized algorithm that tries to help light find its way into occluded areas, which, if you're not familiar with that term, an occluded area is just an area where there's no direct path to the light source. So if my light is over here to the right of our frame and we see this shadow underneath the PCB, this is an occluded area because the light can't easily find its way in here. Interior mode is kind of like holding up a magnet to these areas that are hard to get to help light find its way in. And as a result, it's actually a bit more of a optimized algorithm that gives us a faster frame rate. So even though this isn't an interior, if I'm really trying to get the fastest render times possible, I would maybe consider using interior mode over product mode. The other interesting thing about interior mode is because when you render interiors, they are inherently noisy. They usually give you a lot of these kind of fireflies, like this graininess. Interior mode, well before Keyshot added denoising, it actually has a denoising algorithm built into it, so it helps to smooth the image out a little bit as well. The benefit is for you as an end user, you can get to a more complete looking image without having to render as many samples potentially, or you'll just get a faster frame rate. So long explanation there, but I hope to make that clear. Product mode and interior mode can be used with whatever scene you want, with the main difference being that one of these is more optimized for interiors or occluded areas. But the trade-off that you'll get is sometimes the actual color and the appearance of certain materials will look different. Let's show you what I mean. See this ribbon right here? See the dark part of this ribbon? If I go to interior mode, you'll notice it actually gets a bunch brighter here. Which one of these is more accurate is kind of up for debate, but that's not really what's most important here. They're just two different flavors of rendering. And as you look through your scene, if you prefer one look over the other, then just use that one. Or if you need to optimize for render times, then perhaps you'll find interior mode to be a little bit more advantageous for you. When we go to jewelry mode for our lighting preset, we'll see that we're back down to, it's jumping between, it was like 11 to 18, but now we're sitting right around 18 frames per second, it looks like. With this one, the big change is that it really prioritizes these ray bounces here with a high number of 24. But you'll also see it uses interior mode as well. Okay, so we have these lighting presets. We also have a custom option, which you can save a custom defined option if you want. These lighting presets are Luxion's attempt to make choosing render settings easier for somebody who doesn't really know what all these things do or what they mean. My general suggestion typically has always been to use product mode because it's going to work in most scenarios. However, when it comes to really understanding these and optimizing for render settings, you should understand what all these little options mean down here. So that's what we're gonna talk about next. Within our environment lighting, we have shadow quality. This, if you hover, it will give you a tip. It says, this is the quality of our ground and object shadows. If I'm not mistaken, these are actually only really affected by lights coming from HDRI lighting or environment lighting. So I don't tend to really mess with this. In theory, the lower this number, the faster it should render. Let's just test this out. If I set this to 1, let's look at our frames per second. It's gonna sit right around, it looks like 14 maybe. And if I crank this up to, how high will it go? 5? So we were at 14 and we are still at 14. So this is having a negligible effect. And I think primarily that's because I'm using physical lighting here. And the other thing I've noticed is when I increase this, typically I've noticed a visual change when I've got a ground plane and an HDRI. And what I notice is the lower this number is, the simpler the shadows will look. Whereas if I increase it, it will calculate a new shadow for each pin or each light source within the HDRI. So this is more realistic and this is more generalized. And the higher this number goes, in theory, the longer it'll take to render. Ground illumination, if we have a ground plane, this is gonna have the light bounce off of it. I wanna make sure this is off because the way I design this scene is it's floating in space and I don't want any light bouncing off any sort of ground plane, casting light that I didn't intend to. So I wanna make sure this is off for my scene. Self shadows is very important. If I turn this off, it means that the individual pieces of geometry here are not casting shadows onto other parts. So notice this shadow kind of disappeared or it didn't get very dark underneath this PCB. We need this on if we want things to look realistic. So almost always you want to leave this on. Next we have general lighting. Ray bounces, if we hover, this says the max number of times light's reflected or refracted as it passes through the scene. It's pretty good definition. Light is gonna be thrown in here and every time it hits a surface, it's gonna bounce onto another surface and another and another. After this many interactions or bounces off one surface to another, KeyShot is gonna stop calculating this light. So what this means is the higher this number, the longer it's gonna take to render for sure. But if we reduce this number all the way down to 1, let's see something. So if we go all the way down to 1, in this scene you don't see a huge difference because we're not relying heavily on indirect lighting. However, we are going to notice that the shadows are like pitch black. And that's because the light comes into one of these, let's say where the screw is, the light comes down in here, it bounces off the surface, and then KeyShot stops tracing it. If I set this up to something like 6, some of these areas are gonna get brighter because in some cases, the light is gonna bounce 2 or 3 or 4 times, and that's gonna help transport light to different areas within this scene. The idea, or the way you normally set this value is you start to increase it until you don't see any sort of improvement. So if I go ahead and jump from 6 to, let's say, 12, so I've doubled the number, if I don't notice a drastic change, especially in some of these darker areas, then typically increasing this value is not gonna help. This will also depend on materials. So if you have transparent materials, then having not having enough ray bounces means light won't actually go through or illuminate other surfaces on the other side of clear materials. Let's see if I can show you this. If we look here in these LEDs, and I'll disable depth of field for a second, these LEDs, these boxes here are actually glass or transparent material. So when I set them to ray bounce of 1, they look black like plastic. So if I go from 1 to 2, not a huge change. If I go to 3, they get a little brighter. If I go to 4, they get a little brighter. 5, there they brighten quite a bit. 6, a little brighter. So what's going on here is every time light goes through a transparent material's surface, it consumes a ray bounce. And we need to have enough ray bounces for the light to move through all these layers and then bounce back out. So if I go up to 12 now and these get a little bit clearer or brighter, then I'm still benefiting from increasing the ray bounces. But at some point, we get to diminished returns where increasing this number does not help anything anymore. Generally speaking, I find, for a scene like this, probably 10, probably 12 is going to be plenty. If you can decrease this without seeing anything start to look weird, and especially in transparent materials and such, then you're at a good number. So if I were to draw a little region render, Control-Shift-R around, say, one of these LEDs, and I want to speed this up, so I'm going to increase my CPU usage. If I go from, say, 12 ray bounces to 10, let's see if I see any major difference there. I do not. Let's go down to 8. I don't see any improvement by going down to 8, or I don't see it get worse when I go to 8. Let's try 6. I don't really see any difference when I go down to 6. Let's try 4. Definitely see a difference there. So I know I need a minimum of 6. I like to err on the side of being safe, so I'll probably go from 6 to 8. Global illumination, if I turn this off, we're going to notice some things go dark again. Global illumination is basically indirect bounce. So light rays that bounce between pieces of geometry, again, areas where light is not easily finding its way into, will get brighter if you increase global illumination. It looks more realistic. It will also transport like color of light. So let's say you have a red wall and a white floor, and light bounces off the red wall. That white floor is going to look a little bit red because some of the light coming off of that wall. That's called global illumination. So if you were to turn this box off, that red wall would not cast any sort of red light onto the white floor in that scenario. So I suggest you always leave this on. It looks a lot better. But for some basic animations, you could get away with turning it off. It just may not look as natural or realistic. Global illumination also affects render time for sure. If we're sitting at 150 frames per second, let's turn it off and see what happens. Almost 200 frames per second. So that has a big impact on render time. Next, let's look at GI bounces. By default, we have 1. If we increase this to 10, it's subtle, but in the real-time view, I get a little bit brighter. Some of these occluded areas get a little bit brighter. Let's go down to 1. It's subtle, but it's there. If we look at the frames per second and we increase this from 1 to 10, we drop about 20 frames per second about. So it will affect render time, but not nearly as significantly as just turning on global illumination. I'll leave this at 1 for now. I think that looks fine. Next, we need caustics. Well, here's the interesting thing. These little LEDs, they are glass, and if I want light to pass through them correctly, I technically should have caustics enabled. You'll notice this little LED got significantly brighter when I turned on caustics, which is cool because that means it's going to render as it should. The downside, however, is that we cut our frames per second down almost in half by turning on caustics. That is going to severely cripple our render time. I generally don't recommend you render with caustics unless you really need it, because for an animation, that can way slow down your render time. You're going to have to decide for you if you're seeing benefits from them or if you can live without them. In this case, I can kind of fake it by changing the material so it looks a little brighter like this, even with caustics disabled. So that may be the way I render this scene. If I get rid of this region render, we can see what the scene looks like with caustics on. Let me reset my camera and let's go back to those caustics. So here's my scene with caustics on. And when I turn it off, I think other than these little LEDs, I don't think I'm gonna see a big difference. Not much. The other areas that could be affected by caustics is some light that comes off of these metal parts because they're fully specular. But again, not gonna really make or break this scene, if you ask me. I'm going to, after discovering how much of a hit this takes on my render time, I'm gonna go back and change these little LEDs so they look bright without caustics, if I can. I also have rendering technique. Now, one other interesting thing we can test is to see if interior mode makes caustics quite a bit faster. With caustics, I'm rendering at 15 frames a second. If I pop into interior mode, that goes up to 23, 24 frames a second. That's actually looking pretty good. So if I really wanted caustics, I could know that interior mode is gonna help me render those a lot faster. So that's an option too. And then without caustics, interior mode is sitting at 29 frames a second, whereas product mode's sitting at 17, so almost twice the speed. So big consideration there. I will admit I am a little bit partial to rendering in product mode. I've gotten more used to the way things look in product mode and I really like it. So I may stick with product mode, but that said, if I switch to interior mode and I turn on caustics and I'm still rendering faster than I would just in product mode, then maybe I'll stick with this. We'll see. I think for now I want to optimize for using product mode, so I'll not use interior mode. I'm going to turn off caustics because again that could kill my render times, and I'm going to go back and modify the materials on these little lights a little bit later. And I want to save this as a custom preset because now that I've done a basic check, I have determined that this scene should render pretty well with these settings. So what I can do is create a custom render setting, and I'll call this one Google Home Mini Animation, and I'll just save it like that. Now, later, I can come back to this and use this for my final rendering. So that's a little overview. I know that went pretty long, but there's a lot to talk about. That's an overview of the heads-up display and the real-time render settings and how they affect what you see as well as render times overall.